Hello, my name is Kevin Clouther. I'm an associate professor in the Writers' Workshop at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and I'm here to welcome you to Virtual AWP Pedagogy, Content Warnings in the Classroom. I want to introduce you first to our three panelists today. Ambereen Dadabhoy is an associate professor of literature at Harvey Mudd College. Her research focuses on cross-cultural encounters in the early modern Mediterranean and race and religion in early modern English drama. She investigates the various discourses that construct and reinforce human difference and how they are mobilized in the global imperial projects that characterize much of the early modern period. Ambereen is co-author of Anti-Racist Shakespeare, and she has just completed her monograph, Shakespeare Through Islamic Worlds, which investigates the paucity of Muslim representation in Shakespeare's works, despite their ubiquitous presence in his preferred setting of the Mediterranean Sea. Annabel Lyon is the author of 8 books of fiction and nonfiction for adults and children, most recently the novel Consent. She is the director of the School of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada, located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. John Vigna's first book of fiction, Bullhead, was published to critical acclaim in Canada and the US in 2012 and in France in 2017. His novel No Man's Land was published in fall 2021. He is an associate professor of teaching and pedagogy chair at the School of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, where his focus is on pedagogical and curricular strategies for 5,500 creative writing students across the MFA, BFA major, and undergraduate minor programs. Ambereen, Annabel, John, thank you all so much for joining me today. We're going to go in the order I just listed, and I'll start with our first question. When do you encourage or require content warnings in a creative writing classroom?
Teacher, so my comments will be on the literature classroom. And I guess I don't require them where content warnings come in, particularly in my Shakespeare classroom or even more broadly in my kind of general English classroom, are with texts that I know have a certain kind of explicit violence. So for example, if I'm teaching a course on Me Too Shakespeare, I feel like the content warning is already explicit in the topic of the course, but then I do warn them about certain plays like Titus Andronicus, for example, in terms of what's going to come. And the content warning there is not just about the sexual violence, which is off stage and it's all the ramifications of the sexual violence that we see on stage, but also the extreme racism of the play, right? And so for me, content warnings are always about the kinds of harm that people can experience, and that harm can be varied. And so obviously I won't cover everything, but I try to sort of just warn them that not only is this a play that is a problematic representation of Blackness, but also that this is a play where there is rape and mutilation happening too. But also there's a play also has cannibalism in it too, and like killing of children. There's so much, right? And so I feel like where I get into trouble a little bit with content warnings, and I hope we talk about this, is like, where does the list end with what we warn people about? So I guess I'll just stop there.
Yeah, I mean, if I can pick up on that, I think what I do in the classroom, Ambereen, kind of parallels exactly what you described in my syllabus anyway. And I know John and I have worked together on sort of crafting our approach to content warnings in the classroom. And my syllabus, we definitely point to suicide, self-harm, and racialized or sexualized violence, and say that if a student is intending to submit work that touches on any of those topics, we require them to submit it first ahead of class to the instructor, so that we can have a kind of heads up and go over and see if it's even appropriate to share in class. And also, looping in suicide there, it's a chance for us to check in with the student and make sure they're okay. And then In terms of readings, that I might want to share with the class, it's the same kind of thing, where I would either provide a content warning, or depending on the sort of level of the class, it's going to differ from a 200 level sort of intro class to a master's class, but I may or may not decide to include materials that engage with those sorts of topics at all. And maybe I'll kick it to you, John, and you can kind of flesh that out a little bit more, because we have worked together quite closely on this.
Yeah, thanks, Annabel. And it's interesting because I was thinking when we were having this discussion how to talk about the approaches to content warnings when we are, or content notes, as I like to sort of refer to them anyways, versus a large class. Annabel and I both teach large lecture classes that are up to 250 students. And how do you sort of grapple with that within that class? And also the smaller BFA or MFA workshops of 12. And I think some of the things I've thought about in doing this with both sets of audiences of very different writers for sure is, early in the course, just having that open discussion on the types of writing that's encouraged or discouraged, mostly due to the fact that we are working in an academic environment. The university does have a policy on this that we cite in our syllabi. And in this discussion, having students feel like they are the drivers of the of what they feel would be really something to sort of focus on in terms of content warnings. So they raise points via the discussion that we have in class, email afterwards if they're not comfortable in that setting, a discussion thread that is also posted online, or anonymously through a live Mentimeter presentation on content notes as well. So after we kind of go through this in the first class or two, they have all this input. I go ahead and draft a policy that is basically formulated on what they have suggested as a group, really, and then submit it to the class, whether it's grads or undergrads. It's just sort of, this is what I heard. This is what I'm sort of trying to put together for what you folks have outlined, and then get their sort of final okay on that. And that pretty much determines how we'll proceed from that point, whether I am like firmly for or against the content note is no longer of importance, because it's really what's going to make the students feel empowered and sort of safe in this setting here. So it's drawn by them, it's created by them, and the whole process is not only educational in this way, but it's also empowering, because it's something that doesn't feel like it's coming for them from the top down, but it's more like a flat sort of process. And then the interesting thing is that since this policy is co-authored by the students, they also get to kind of keep this front of mind with one another if anyone varies from this. So they're encouraged to put content notes on the work as it warrants it. In the past, what I've noticed, especially for grads and actually for undergrads as well, is what I've noticed is that the majority of the content notes are actually what I would term as unwarranted. They're just really trying to play it safe. They're being hypersensitive here and respectful for their peers. And I feel like this is kind of the win-win of the situation. I think in many ways, just kind of erring on the side of caution is just better than the alternative, which can be so much more damaging for everyone involved.
Okay, thank you all for that. I want to get into some specifics, and then I want to engage in some of the controversies, so to speak, around this and go through some examples. But let's get into the specifics first, and we'll go in reverse order this time, starting with John. What makes a content warning effective rather than pro forma?
Yeah, this is a great question, of course, Kevin. I think, it's like anything else that we do with writing, it's iterative, and there's no one size fits all, for example. Because these, as I was saying earlier, is that we discuss and co-author these together, and then I go ahead and draft them. They get approved by the students. There's one other piece that kind of fits in with the students in sort of creating a content note that's effective here, is that I also post on the homepage in Canvas my own statement of inclusion and anti-racism. And so it kind of sets the tone a little bit for my position within the course and how I'm just trying to encourage this as modeling for the students as well. So with that piece, and along with them co-authoring the guidelines, then is we go ahead and we update it in the syllabus. We review the policy as a group together. We discuss often why these guidelines exist and give examples, you know, as Annabelle was referring to earlier, material that might require discussion with the instructor prior to the workshop submission. So Annabelle had mentioned that we do have some language in our syllabi around topics that students are discouraged to write about just simply because we are in the academic environment. And then we also talk about what will happen if the student doesn't follow these guidelines. Do we go ahead and how do we react as a group here? So the goal is overall to sort of communicate with the students and have them kind of buy in with is that it's responsible representation, not censorship, because that's always the question that really comes up here too. So that's where I start from. Annabelle, do you want to add more to that?
For sure. I mean, I think for me, a real kind of watershed moment was in one of those large 250-person classes that you mentioned. And we were reading a story by the Vancouver author Shashi Bhatt called Help Me, John, Why I Read Beowulf, I think, and which includes a reference to sexual violence towards an underage person. And I had provided a content warning and thought I had done everything right. And a student came up to me after class and said, you know, this was horrific for me to read from personal experience. And it's all very well that you provided a content warning, but then you also had, and I can't remember if it was a quiz or a little assignment or something that came out of this story. So there was no opt-out for me. I had to engage with this. I had to read it. And I learned so much from that moment because I realized that a content warning that doesn't provide that extra level of safety for the student is meaningless. It's really, you're basically saying, I'm going to traumatize you. Go prepare yourself. If you can't offer an opt-out, if you can't say, you know, this story contains reference to whatever, pedophilia, sexualized violence, if you don't feel that you want to engage with this story, here's an alternate assignment that you can do, no questions asked. I don't need to know the reason why. I don't need to know anything more about it, or else I can just, you know, remove it from the total of your grade and you just don't have to do this assignment. But I think that piece for me has been really key. And I learned it from that one student coming up to me and saying, you know, I had this horrible experience in your classroom. Please find a better way.
Yeah, everything both John and Annabelle are saying really resonates with me in terms of my literature classrooms. I do a lot of work at the beginning of every course to kind of scaffold some kind of community norms that include, right, they are not sharing their own work, but that include the kinds of norms that we're going to have in our discussion. And, you know, every time you'll get one that's like, you know, be respectful to everyone. And that's a good moment to think about what respect means and what kind of how we have these standards of everybody must be respected and what is it that we're respecting about them. And I don't disagree that we should respect everyone, but I do disagree that every point of view doesn't need to be respected, right? And it opens up that moment for what is it that we allow in this classroom for us to say and speak and critically debate, and what is debated out in the outside world that we don't necessarily need to entertain in our room, right? And so that really gives them a chance to see how we make decisions about what it is that is critical, important, and knowledge making that's going to happen in this classroom and things that happen outside. And in the context of content warnings or content notes, I really like that phrase, John. I always think about when I'm listening to NPR in the mornings, and they sometimes have a content warning that's like, you know, some listeners might find this troubling. And it's always some kind of story about some kind of violence that has happened in the global South. And then I think about how if we have gone through that violence, of course we will find that disturbing because it will trigger things for us, our own traumatic experiences. But shouldn't everybody be troubled by this news story, right? That is so horribly violent and degrading and dehumanizing. And yet we're saying that for some, this is going to be more troubling than others. And so I don't have an answer to that, but I always think about that as this is a moment of, this is a story, this is a piece of fiction or something that is designed to sort of cause us to reflect on something. And I obviously will not force students who are maybe more triggered by it than other students will be to sit with this and engage with this. And so I do give these alternate assignments, but I want all of my students to think about why this would be troubling to someone, even if you haven't gone through it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just want to follow up briefly on one thing that Annabelle said. I think it's so important when you give people an opportunity to opt out that you actually give them an opportunity. And an example would be at the University of Nebraska MFA in writing, we have student readings, and students get up and, one after another, they read any number of things. Sometimes they're completely imagined, sometimes they're autobiographical. But it's important, and the students are so good about doing this, it's important that after the student says content warning, violence, for example, that there's then a pause and a chance for people to leave the room if they don't want to participate in that. Because what I've seen in other settings is there'll be a content warning, and then the person will immediately begin reading, and people don't really feel as though there is an opportunity to opt out. And that way it does just seem pro forma. Let's stay with you, Annabelle, and get into, I think, the way that people so often talk about content warnings, and to my mind, in sort of a reductive way. And I'm confident that we can talk about it in a more nuanced and interesting way. How do you respond to the common criticisms of content warnings that they either coddle students or they restrict how instructors teach?
Yeah, so I mean, 10 years ago, I think that would have been me. I would have been that person saying that. And my thinking has really developed. I don't know, evolved. It's developed, it's changed, over time. And my sort of quick knee-jerk reaction to that is, well, yes, it does restrict how instructors teach. Just as a seatbelt restricts your movement in a car, does that mean it's a bad thing? No, it's not a bad thing. I do have a document that I share with my students. I post it into our sort of online materials for every class, and I try to contextualize, content warnings. For instance, we're used to seeing them in the movies all the time. Some material may not be suitable for all audiences, rated X, for scenes of violence or whatever. And nobody going to the movies or watching a Netflix show or whatever is going to say, oh, you've just destroyed my experience of this because somehow I now know what's coming, and I'm going to be seeing it through a whole different lens. And so I try and get students to sort of connect to that part of themselves that's used to content warnings. It's not a big deal, and kind of bring that back to the writing. I also do present sort of two different writers who have different approaches to this. Katarina Vermette is a Indigenous Canadian author. She's actually a grad of our program and wrote a book, fabulous book called The Break, which includes a content warning right at the very start. And I can read it to you. It says, "Trigger warning, this book is about recovering and healing from violence, contains scenes of sexual and physical violence and depictions of vicarious trauma." And so for Katarina, she felt that it was really important to put that right out there at the beginning of the book so that people could then make their choices. And I like to contrast that with students with a quote from Roxane Gay, who is very, or at least in previous writings, has been very against trigger warnings. And so from an essay called The Illusion of Safety, The Safety of Illusion, it's in her fabulous collection, Bad Feminist, she says, "There are things that rip my skin open and reveal what lies beneath. But I don't believe in trigger warnings. I don't believe people can be protected from their histories. I don't believe it is at all possible to anticipate the histories of others. There is no standard for trigger warnings, no universal guidelines. Once you start, where do you stop? Does the mention of the word rape require a trigger warning, or is the threshold the account of rape? It all seems so futile, so impotent, and at times belittling. When I see trigger warnings, I think, how dare you presume what I need to be protected from?" which I think is a really compelling articulation of sort of something that we've each alluded to, Ambereen and John as well, which is, yeah, once you start, where do you stop? And I remember when we first started having this conversation about trigger warnings, maybe I feel like it was maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, in my undergrad classes, suddenly they were all putting trigger warnings for everything. Trigger warning, someone's going to be drinking a beer in this story. Like literally, that's one of the ones that I saw. Or trigger warning, someone says damn or fuck or whatever. And it's like, okay, guys, let's stop and step back and sort of think about the purpose of this warning and think about how we could be crying wolf with these warnings too. And is there ever going to be a really bright line that we can draw and say, okay, this needs a warning and this doesn't? No, of course not, because the smell of roses could be incredibly triggering for somebody if they had something horrible happen to them while they were able to smell roses. But I think we have to sort of say there are a certain core of things that I think we can agree, a visceral description of racialized violence has the potential to be triggering to a large number of people. It's predictable, it's sort of stable in a, if I can put that in a sort of horrible way. So I'm getting a little bit away from your question here, but are we coddling students? Are we restricting how instructors teach? I want to say a little bit yes, but for reasons that outweigh the negatives of, I kind of object to the word coddling. We're caring for, I think, rather than coddling. And those restrictions on how I teach, I'm willing to give those up because I can still teach the same concepts without necessarily needing to engage with material that is potentially hurting my students. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything Annabel has said, and I have found myself falling on the side of being very persuaded by Roxane Gay's argument when I read it first when I read Bad Feminist, and then I recently reread Kate Mann. I think had an op-ed in the New Yorker on this same topic. And she takes the opposite approach to it. And I think one way that we can sort of get around this sort of coddling question is that the people for whom we are giving these content warnings have not been coddled by the world. In fact, they have experienced probably the worst of the world. And so there's no coddling that's happening here. So they are already living in the real world where these things have happened to them, to people they know, to the group that they belong to, all of these things. So I feel like that is that argument doesn't hold weight with me, that these students aren't living in the real world and we're like turning them into snowflakes. And especially if we think about the extent to which things are being banned across the country right now, that's coddling of the American mind, not giving students a heads up about what's going to happen. And when you do, when these kinds of policies arise in class, not from the top down, and this is Kate Mann's argument, but this is also following on what John and Annabel have said, that they arise organically from the environment that we have created in the classroom, then we are not inhibiting our academic freedom. In fact, we're kind of using constraint as an important teaching method for our students. And so we're just stretching what we can do actually with our academic freedom in an ethical and responsible way. So that's all I got.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that. This is wonderful. I really enjoy this conversation around this point here. I think about if our classrooms are meant to be spaces where creative risks can take place, where our students can feel empowered and comfortable to engage in their own work and in the work of others, then I feel like content notes are really just one more sign of offering support or signaling respect for the diverse population of students that are in our classrooms. I don't see it as any coddling as, then drawing up a clear set of assignment guidelines, or it's just another guideline, but it's an important one because we can't be sure of what's going to affect our students' experience of the material in the course, but we can offer some sense of parameters around the more obvious subjects that can be harmful to them. And I think it's interesting too here that how, we should note that, like, Annabel, from that quote, those quotes that you read, or those warnings that you had read, how far this has traveled in 6 or 7 years to this date, is we used to refer to these strictly as trigger warnings. And then there was a whole discussion around the efficacy of trigger warning versus content warning. And, when we have this discussion in class now, most of the students really seem to sort of feel like a content note is sort of less inflammatory, or what's the word I'm looking for? Just something that feels less charged. And so they feel like already they can kind of approach it, rather than there's this sharp kind of warning about what could potentially come from what's going to be in the text here. So it sets up the text a little more, and it also sets up kind of how the students are able to sort of think about their work. And, this, Ambereen, the point you raised around constraints, I think, is a really important one. I think rather than these notes as being restricting us, what we can teach, I think they challenge us more to find more effective, creative ways for approaching all these different types of materials that we're seeing in our classrooms now. And in this view, I really feel like the content notes are really just yet another constraint that all of us must inhabit, not only in our discipline, but sort of moving through the world in general, and how we know these can be effective as a real sort of focusing agent in our own writing process. So they're also powerful in our teaching practices as well.
Can I just add a quick comment there?
Yeah, please.
I was thinking, John, as you were talking too, that, often I think where we hear that argument that, trigger warnings or content warnings or content notes are somehow coddling students, or that they have no place in the classroom, we'll often hear that from some students in the class, often quite privileged students who feel that they should be able to do what they want and say what they want, and so on. And the comeback that I always have with those students is, you're not getting anything. You sort of appeal to their selfishness and say, if what you want is feedback from your peers, if you have traumatized your peer, you're not getting anything useful back from them. So what's the point? All you're doing is reducing what you're able to get from the people around you. And it always feels a little icky to appeal to people's selfishness, but sometimes that's the argument that students will hear, and then they'll kind of click and understand and say, oh, okay, I get it. If I actually genuinely want feedback on my writing, that's something that I do have to take into account.
I mean, I if you don't mind, Kevin, if I respond as well, I just think, this is really kind of getting to more what we're all thinking about more as instructors every day, is we're moving away from sort of entrenched ways of working with material and teaching our students to more of a pedagogy of care and compassion. That does not mean we're creating softer, coddling environments, but we're reacting and sort of responding to the changing needs here, instead of just staying static this way. And I think that's vital to think about, whether it's content notes or anything else that's going on. That consistency of care and compassion across the course then allows an instructor, as Annabel, you were just saying, to sort of respond to a student who might come from a place of privilege and not get what's going on, and they can still feel like they are being cared for in that situation, so that it's not in any way also eliminating them from the discussion, because they really need to be a part of that as well.
And I just want to add that there's no sacrifice in rigor for when we do these things. So your example, Annabelle, is still rooted in like the rigor of the feedback, right? Like, what are you getting for your work? You're not getting the thing that you want if you do this thing. So I think that's the feeling that coddling somehow and we're not coddling, right? But that when we make these spaces of care and compassion, that we have then sort of divested ourselves from the rigor of learning. And in fact, it's actually the opposite that's happening.
The evolution of language here, I think, is so interesting too, because how different does a content note sound from a trigger warning? You know, those two phrases land to my ear really differently, and I think that speaks to the evolution, the way that we've talked about this. Let's talk about some boundaries and limitations, and we'll start with you, John, and then we'll go to Ambereen and finish with Annabel. Are there texts either published or by a student that you will not share with a classroom because of the material? And I will say that this is more challenging for me with the student work than it is with the published work, but I want to hear what each of you think about it.
Yeah, of course, such a tricky place to inhabit as instructors. One of the things that we, Annabel, and you can speak more to this as well, that include generally as a unit at our institution, in our school, is a content advisory policy within our syllabi. This is done across the unit as well. So we state up front that we're encouraging, creativity and taking risks in the class, and also stating outright that there are just some types of writing that do not fulfill the requirements for this course. And some of those would be texts that are include, but are perhaps not limited to, things like fan fiction, personal journaling, writing about having to write something for this class, writing about your grades, writing about your TAs and or instructor or fellow students. And then also getting into more kind of granular stuff around writing about school shootings or similar violence. And so we also, rather than sort of, leaving it there, we also say, okay, if you plan on submitting work that is going to depict sexualized, racialized, or gendered violence, you must speak with the instructor well in advance of the assignment deadline before you start your draft. And this is not to say like your full permission will be granted for them, but really kind of getting a sense of where the student's coming from and how they understand the conversation that's going on right now. So generally, this sort of eliminates so many of the texts that can come through the classroom, rather than offering specific examples. Sort of using this policy has been quite, touch wood, generally effective so far.
That sounds like a fantastic policy. I'll keep this short. I think I'll just come back to, in terms of things that don't make it into my classroom, are things that, again, are designed to denigrate people on some axis of identity, right? Like, students can easily find all of this information outside. And if they actually want to talk about it with me to figure out how to manage those things, I'm happy and available in office hours. But that precious classroom time needs to be devoted to the kind of work and inquiry that we're committed to doing together in class. So that's my answer.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of best practices for content warnings, I think that opt-out, again, for me is really key. You have to give the student a meaningful way to continue to participate in the class. And something we haven't talked about yet, and I'd be really curious to hear from all of you, Kevin, Ambereen, John, what do you do when opting out makes the student very visible in the class? I think it's very different what I would do in a class of 200 or 250 people, when if a student just decides not to submit something in like we use Canvas as our online platform, they just don't submit an assignment. Nobody else is going to know about that. But in a 10, 12 person MFA level class, if somebody has to get up and leave the room because they can't engage with something, that's really shining a spotlight. And I think that becomes a real challenge. Like, how do we not, it's exactly what you were talking about, Kevin, with that reading series that you have. You give them the moment to leave, absolutely, because a content warning where the person says, oh yeah, content warning, there's going to be violence, here I go, and then they read, serves no one. But then if the person has to get up and leave the room and everybody's kind of watching them go, that's a bit of a problem too. So this is my meandering way of saying, I think I would tailor things differently depending on the size and the makeup and the maturity level of the class.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in there briefly and say that at both the undergraduate and graduate level in the courses I teach, the manuscripts are circulated at least a week in advance. And there's a best practices document that we go over at the beginning of the semester, and that we also post to Canvas, which is the online portal we use, that says right at the top, if you want to opt out of a workshop, you may do so. Let your workshop facilitator know before the start of the workshop. And so if there's anybody who's not there, everybody in the room already knows that that policy exists. It's not like somebody gets up and leaves the classroom.
I'll add that that has been effective too for both BFA and MFA workshops where I've been in. It's because the work is submitted well in advance, because we've come up with this sort of approach as a group rather than top down. Then there's really no question of why so and so is not there for the first half hour of the class or hour, depending on how the sort of structure of the class is going to be designed, which is also stated in front which pieces we're going to do in which order. So that sort of offers that as well too.
Yeah, I do something very similar in my literature courses too, in terms of announcing that if any of the material, if they want to opt out, we can do something else that they can still participate in the work of the course, so they're not missing out on anything. And there's no penalty for this opt out. I think it's really important to like scaffold that in terms of the pre-circulation that you all are talking about, and just letting students know, again, if you're establishing some kind of community norms or guidelines in your classroom, then you've already kind of created that trust where students feel like they can come to you with this and they're not having to expose themselves. And again, I don't need a explanation of any sort. I just need you to tell me I can't, this one's not for me, and that's it.
Yeah, and I will say anecdotally, I've never had a student take advantage of this policy. It just hasn't been a problem. I only have one more question for the group, and then I'll create an opportunity for people to talk about things that haven't come up already. And I know John and Annabel, you've talked about this a little bit, so we'll start with Ambereen and hear from her first. Does your department / college / university have a best practices for content warnings? And if so, how was that policy created?
This is an easy one. No. We have no official policy for anything, and it's really ad hoc in terms of in my department how this works. And I teach at a school that is a STEM liberal arts college, and so in general, these conversations would happen in my department, and so we just sort of, have hallway conversation about how we handle these things, and we as a department haven't even necessarily regularized anything.
I mean, I would say in our unit, we don't have a policy that everyone is forced to adhere to, but we do have a syllabus template that has language that I think a lot of us do adopt. And we do talk about these things. I mean, we have a pretty lively pedagogy group in our unit, and we do share how we do these sorts of things. So, I mean, it's not one size fits all, but I think it's a part of the water that we're all swimming in. Like we have these conversations regularly, wouldn't you say, John?
Yeah, and I would say, just to add to that, Annabelle, the other piece of it is that, the university does have an inclusivity and respectful environment policy or statement that we do include in the syllabi. So that kind of gives the foundational piece of which we can sort of approach this idea of content notes with our students, and that so they understand that it's not just something we're sort of coming up with for a variety of reasons, but it actually is grounded in the fact that we are in this academic environment, and there are certain rules and regulations, if you will, that we must follow being in this environment together.
Annabel, Ambereen, John, thank you so much for your time today. Are there other dimensions to this that any of you would like to introduce before we sign off?
It's so hard to know. I mean, this feels like a massive topic, and there really isn't. I think that's my takeaway, is there's not a one size fits all approach. You really have to consider from term to term, from class to class, who are you standing in front of? Who's in this room? how visible are their actions to their peers? How much are they submitting to each other? How much are they just sharing with you, the instructor? You know, is this a class of 250 19-year-olds? Is this a class of 12 35-year-olds and upward that you're teaching in an online context? I think you have to really consider the context in dealing with this, and considering the safety of everybody in the classroom, and the ability of the people in the classroom to thrive. Just as Ambereen and John have been talking about, it is creating that pedagogy of care and tailoring it to the room that you're in every time. I don't think it's a box you can tick. I think it's something that needs careful attention every time you start a term with a new class.
And I will also say that I think this conversation is so vital and important, and I would like to see it coupled with what is happening, at least in the United States, in terms of suppressing ideas, right? And like content warnings are also seen weaponized as doing that, when in fact that's the opposite of what is being attempted. But really to engage with our students into the complexities of these things. And it's not just these are the two options, there's so many more, but really getting them to think about the power of words, which is what we're really talking about when we're giving them these content warnings, and when something is unnecessary and gratuitous, and when something is actually politically necessary for the things that we're trying to do. And that's what they're wrestling with as young writers themselves, and even as like people who are interested in literature and why literature matters. So really, like, I hope that there will be a virtual pedagogy workshop that I can learn from that's about the other side of this content warning debate.
Now, I'd just add to that from the point, Ambereen, that you raised earlier about the pedagogy of care and compassion is not a lack of rigor. In fact, it's increased rigor. And I think this is important for all of instructors to keep in mind now. Is it's hard work that we're doing here, just like it is for our students. And like, Annabel, as you suggested, like you really, each term, each group of students, you could have 3 different classes that term, and they could all be wildly different on this approach here too. And I think what's pretty exciting, but also daunting from an instructor perspective, is it really requires nimbleness to go across all of this instead of just kind of mailing it in or having your checklist, because a checklist will not suffice in any way for this. And I think, in my better moments, I would say this is really great to go through, because it's really kind of stretching how we teach and think about things. And perhaps in my worst moments, I'd be thinking like, well, wouldn't it just be easier if we just didn't have this as an issue? But the reality is like the way the conversation is going on in the world in general, with all the things that we're approaching, it's pretty rad, actually, the fact that we're now engaging with our students in ways to think critically about the ways that we're expressing ourselves, and what's okay and what's not, and how to sort of be in those gray spaces instead of just paying lip service to it.
I think that's a good place to end. Ambereen, Annabel, John, thank you all so much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all.